morning, everyone, and welcome to this thinking that asks what seems in many ways to be an unanswerable question. Unanswerable in the sense that surely it's self-evident that the ethnicity pay gap should be mandatory. If we think a gender pay gap should be mandatory, then we must undoubtedly surely care as much about enforcing fairness in the workplace on matters of race as much as gender. And so what we're trying to understand today is what are the obstacles to making that happen. My name's James Harding, I'm the editor and co-founder of Tortoise, and I'm really delighted today that we've got three people who are joining us and a group of people getting up early in the morning to talk at 8 o'clock about how we make the ethnicity pay gap mandatory, why it's not mandatory, and maybe there are reasons that we'll understand in the course of the hour that will reshape and redefine our thinking. I'm joined this morning by Halima Begum from the Runnymede Trust. Halima, thank you very much for joining us. It's really good of you. As we're discovering more and more in life, the things that matter, the things that resolve inequality, the things that are going to address the issues of dignity as well as freedom in our society are going to be resolved by the application of the law, the rules. Given what's happening in Brexit, given what's happening in COVID, we care more and more about application of the law and rules. And so I'm particularly grateful to Tom Hayes from Lewis Silkin, the lawyers who join us as well. And then perhaps most valuably, hello Tom, thank you for joining us today. And then perhaps the most interesting question actually sits with someone like Steve Collinson, who is the head of people at Zurich. Hello, Steve. Thank you for getting up early to talk to us this morning. You know, one of the questions that is going to change the way in which we handle this issue, race in the workplace, is really going to be driven by some of the world's largest companies, and Zurich, obviously, as an insurance company, is thinking deeply about this. So Steve, thank you for helping us. We have a number of different things that we want to try and do to make sure that this is a better informed conversation. If you're new to a thinking, our approach is let's try and have an open editorial meeting. Let's try and make sure that everyone weighs in with their experience and their expertise. Our simple rule is no questions. And the reason for that is we don't want people asking questions that are really statements, but most importantly, we think we can come to a better informed point of view if you share your views too. So please do weigh in. My colleague Liz Mosley is here handling the chat in the course of the hour. Hey Liz, how are you doing? And so please do let me know. I've had a slightly, apologies for the delay this morning, I've had a slightly tricky start to the morning because for some reason I'm on my phone rather than my computer. So I'm going to look to Liz to flag up some of the comments that you're making and make sure that everyone that wants to speak can. Please do let us know what you think. Let us know what you think in the chat. We've got a couple of things we want to try. We want to see if we can run a poll to try and get a sense of people's opinions. And we've prepared a set of slides that look at some of the data in this. But I'm going to start, if I might, with Halima. Halima, why is it that the ethnicity pay gap is not mandatory?
Hi, James. Can you hear me?
Hi, Halima.
So why is the ethnicity pay gap not mandatory?
Yes.
Because the government hasn't acted fast enough to make it mandatory. And I think we now find ourselves in a situation where I suppose the public at large and employers at large are ahead of the government guidelines and the government sentiments on this. So the very fact that companies like Zurich, Deloitte and others are already asking the question, why isn't it mandatory, and indeed have made voluntary action in this space, suggests to us that government is probably out of pace with where we should be on this issue. They would probably argue that it's quite a complex issue to make mandatory. We would probably argue that it doesn't need to be complex. What's really helpful, as you said earlier on, is if you start looking at efforts in the gender space and how we've moved to measure progress in gender equality and the pay gap there, it absolutely is necessary that we follow the same line of thinking, because why would gender be any different to ethnicity, for example? So I think with Black Lives Matter, it's really, really pertinent on us all around this table and actually the audience out there that we do start calling the government to account. I mean, it's amazing that actually it's the private sector and the public sector that is now going to call government to account and say, could you make it mandatory, please?
Yes.
So I think government action has been slow. Nevertheless, the fact that we're all here asking the question, I think is fantastic. It suggests that there is hope.
And Halima, can I just ask you, I saw that Ian Duffy just in the chat just there was saying he thought that the government essentially got derailed by Brexit. That what happened was they just had so much on their political and administrative plate that a year after gender pay gap reporting came in, the mandatory ethnicity pay gap reporting was shelved. The only counter that I've heard to that is that actually, and you hear it from some big companies, I'm sure we'll hear from Steve in a minute, but some big companies say, look, this is more difficult than gender pay gap reporting, because although not everyone self-identifies either male or female, the vast majority of people do, and you can do it much more easily externally. Whereas with ethnicity pay gap reporting, individuals have to tick a box, and often they don't want to necessarily tick that box, and they've got every right not to tick that box. So how much is it the case that there is something that is not necessarily a problem that lies at the door of government or even at big companies, but that's social, even individually?
So I think you're right that there might be some reluctance within the workplace to self-declare, and there are some issues around GDPR, for example, and actually the sensitivity around how we handle data. But that itself does not excuse the lack of action. Now, it may well be Brexit, it could have been something else, but I think what we can all agree on now is that this is a really, really good time to start moving in this area. I think the question around reservations and people's reservations, never mind whether it's mandatory and so on, I think we start have to winning hearts and minds in the workplace and with the public at large. So if we started thinking about this as equality, justice, and something that is inherent in the way in which we should be working, then I think it destigmatizes the idea that by declaring ourselves to belong to a gender or an ethnicity, we're therefore asking for something that isn't a right to begin with. So it should be normalized. I think people generally feel a little bit reserved around disclosing their identity in case they feel there's a penalty out there. And we all know that there's also structural issues around racism in the workplace or in society at large. But I think that if we moved closer towards changing people's attitudes and behaviors around disclosure, that would help. So simply applying a carrot approach, the mandatory approach to reporting on ethnicity isn't going to help. I think we need to also think about other measures in the workplace that make it easier for those of us who want to disclose.
Right, okay. Well, Halima, I'm sure we'll continue with that. I'm going to come to Tom Hayes in a moment, but Tom, if I might, can I just turn to Steve first, because Halima mentioned what it's like in a big company. And Zurich, Steve, will you just tell us what's happening at Zurich, how you're handling this, and what works, what doesn't?
Yeah, of course, happy to. So earlier this year, we made a decision in February to actually publish all of our pay gaps in 2020. So of course, as part of gender pay gap reporting, we've been publishing for the last 3 years our gender pay gap. But in February of this year, we made a decision as an executive team to say, it's time to put all of our diversity characteristics on public display. And it's time to hold ourselves more widely to account. So we started with ethnicity, where we published our pay gap in July of this year. We show a 9.8% ethnicity pay gap. And later in the year, we'll publish our LGBT pay gap, actually in a few weeks' time. And then towards the end of the year, our disability pay gap. We did publish gender pay gap data this year, even though government guidelines were relaxed through COVID. So for us, this is about saying, this is everything there is to know about our organisation from a diversity characteristic perspective. And now the most important thing is, what do you do about it? And how do you start tackling some of the issues? And we've talked about, I think we've been alluding already in the conversation to things like the difference between a requirement for self-declaration when it comes to ethnicity, to disability, to sexuality, compared to gender. And of course, that's true. And I think actually what we're dealing with here is a question of trust between organisations and their employees. Do your employees trust you with their personal data, their very personal data, and do they trust what you'll do with it? And all I can say is that from a standing start 2 years ago, from a declaration perspective, we reached a declaration rate of 86%, which we were very comfortable gave us the right kind of information, very comfortable that we were able to actually assess our ethnicity pay gap based on pretty high levels.
Steve, hold on one second. So just can I understand, just to check the numbers. So 86% of people identified their ethnicity.
Correct.
And then just, I saw Jenny Flynn was asking the 9.8%.
Yeah.
That 9.8%, will you just break down for us what it actually showed you? Because there's different, isn't there? In pay gap reporting, it tends to reveal two things: either two people being paid differently for the same job, but more often in my experience, it reveals structural inequalities in the business where certain sectors of the business, i.e. the top management, is exclusively a one identity, male or white, and others lower down in the business on lower paid grades are not, you know. And so I wonder just whether you're talking about that 9.8% being a structural inequality or a pay difference for the same people doing the same jobs. Yeah,
so really happy to tackle that one. So there is a very clear difference between fair pay, which is whether people doing like jobs are paid like salaries. And we assess fair pay on a number of lenses and have done for a number of years. Using EDGE methodology, we find an external methodology very helpful. So from an equal pay perspective, for both gender and for ethnicity, at my organisation, we've shown parity. So people doing similar jobs broadly are paid similar rates of pay. So fair pay is one lens. The 9.8% that I talked about is an assessment of the average hourly rate of pay for people from the Black, Asian and minority ethnic community compared to their white counterparts. So it's using the same methodology for calculation as the gender pay gap, but applying the ethnicity characteristic. So that's kind of the broad.
And so if you just, and so Steve, if you dig into the 9.8%, do you find that what drives that 9.8%, i.e. is not a fair pay issue, is not people being paid differently for similar jobs, but what I was saying, which is a structural issue in the company, which is more senior people, fewer Black, Asian, ethnic minority people in those senior, better paid jobs?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's exactly the same for gender. The issues as to why it occurs, of course, will be different and nuanced, but that's pretty much the case. From a gender pay gap perspective, we talk about it being more difficult for women to climb the organisation into senior leadership or senior technical positions. And that's what we see that's what our initial view of data shows us from an ethnicity perspective.
Right. And just one final thing, Steve, I'm going to come to Tom in a second. Does your ethnicity pay gap reporting, do you break it at any point by age, out of interest?
We can do, and we're working with the behavioural insights team, the BIT team, used to be part of the UK Government Cabinet Office, now an independent research organisation, in the same way we did with gender pay gap reporting, to understand at forensic detail. We're doing exactly the same for ethnicity too, and of course for the different characteristics of ethnicity, because bringing the reporting, and I've seen in the chat, bringing the reporting, I find the term BAME personally to be unhelpful in many contexts, including in this one, but it does at least help us to start to have the discussion.
Yeah. Well, Steve, we'll come back to get into more detail, because I'm interested in the age issue, partly because at least the gender pay gap showed that many organisations, there was very little gender pay gap in the 20s and 30s, but then it became much more pronounced 40s, 50s and 60s. And that says something about progression, doesn't it, within companies. But Tom, can you just help us out here? Just on one of the issues here is about the law, isn't it? And what's required in the law in terms of rights and expectations of the law as regards gender versus as regards race. So is there a distinction here that we need to understand?
I think there's a practical distinction between doing gender pay gap analysis and then trying to apply the same methodology to ethnicity. I think it would create a lot of problems and difficulties. With gender pay gap reporting, you have men and women in equal quantities across the country, and even in the most skewed of employers, for example, the tech sector, where it's predominantly men, you'll be creating gender pay gap figures of still a fair number of people, even if it's, say, 20% women, and you've got a company of 300 employees, that's still 60 people from whom you're creating a gender pay gap. And an important thing to remember is that the pay gaps are averages. They show the average employee. They don't give any information on how many of a particular gender or ethnicity work at that employer. So when you are working out an average from not very many people, as is the case with ethnicity, because it's a minority, those gaps, the averages that you're creating, are based on a lot fewer people, and it means they're much more subject to change year on year. Just with the hiring or firing of a few employees, what could essentially be random error 1 year from the next, your gaps could change a lot. And if the purpose of gaps is to try and give transparency and to show what progress a company is making towards increasing diversity in a particular area, I'm not sure that having gaps that might change quite radically year from year would be very helpful.
Okay, that's so I'm just checking in on the chat, Tom, because I'd like to bring in some of the I'd like to bring in, Tom, some of the people who are commenting as you were speaking. Can I just ask one issue about individual protection and identity protections when companies move to mandatory pay gap reporting in the event that they do? If I don't want to identify my ethnicity or my background, can I do that? Can I do that if you move to a world in which there is mandatory pay gap reporting?
Well, employers have to use the data that they have. Just thinking about gender again, if an employer doesn't have any information on whether an employee identifies as male or female, then it's not appropriate to assign them to one of those genders. It's a very personal thing. And so leaving them out of the calculations would be the appropriate thing. With ethnicity, I would imagine it's the same thing. You would ask employees to select from a list of ethnicities, tell them why you need to do it if there was a legal obligation. If any don't do it, then I don't think you could include them. I mean, any legislation that comes could explain how to deal with these people.
Right.
But if you did have significant numbers and your numbers are based off of, say, only 80% reporting their ethnicity, then that would be something that you would explain in your report to say, this gap is only based off 4 out of 5 people. Okay,
okay. Tom, that's helpful. I want to just pick up. So listen, I'm going to, if I can, bring in some of the people who've raised points. I see that Fabian McLaughlin's made a point. I saw that Trevor Phillips made a point about just the 86% that Steve mentioned, and Sandra Kerr, who I've talked to about this subject before, and who you know, really knows where around it. I saw has also made a point about how we make it happen. Sandra, can I just bring you in first, if I might?
Yes, hello.
Hi there, how are you?
Fine, thank you. So no, thank you for an opportunity just to really, why hasn't happened? We've had, as I say, there's been the Brexit, there's been the change of government, there's been re-election, reshuffle, COVID-19, but what I think COVID-19 has shown that actually the government can pivot quite quickly, introduce new laws and make change. So I think all the long-term, oh, it's too difficult, well, coronavirus is really difficult, but it hasn't stopped movement forward. So I think that's no longer a point. I think the conversation about declaration, it is voluntary and it's about trust. What we have found, we work with employers who've gone from 26% declaration to 95%, and it's doing the work. So there's work that can be done to get the employees to trust you that actually you're not going to use it to kind of ruin their careers, you're actually going to use it to do good works, and often by demonstrating what an employer has done on gender and other characteristics where it's easier to look at the data, that tends to make the change. I think there are issues. So we've just published recently, a few weeks ago, a Black Voices report where we pulled out all the responses from Black employees to the Race at Work survey data, and it shows there is a perception of not being paid at the right level, not feeling that they're being paid at the right amount, particularly with Black employees. And I know that it's documented by DWP that, for example, the Black African group tend to be highly qualified, but it doesn't translate to promotions. So I think there's an opportunity to publish this data, use it to, you know, to have intelligent insight. Where do you go? You know, where do you start to look? What do you think about as far as where people are deployed in the organization? Sometimes internal occupational segregation, which means people are lower paid and some of the lower paid roles. So not a silver bullet, it's not going to fix everything, but it's absolutely an important marker. And I think for me, the top priority, it gets the conversation to the top table where it needs to be discussed, and it puts everything in the open so that you have to face it rather than, you know, just ignore it and hope that it'll go.
Sandra, can you just explain one thing for us, which is, can you just explain the 26% to 95% that you just mentioned? And if you like, just explain for all of us a little what it is that prevents people from saying their identity. I should say I'm Jewish, and I know that when I get asked my religion or my identity, I get very, very uncomfortable. And I know that I'm being paranoid, and I know that this is irrational, but it also means that when I get the chance, I'll often tick the
prefer not to say
box, you know, whatever that former box is. But I just wanted to understand, you know, different people have different reasons for not giving their identities. Will you just talk through a little what your experience of that is?
Yes, I mean, my main experience is there is that element of what are you going to do with this? So
Yes.
There's an element of, is this going to ruin my life, career, death? Are you actually for negative purposes rather than positive ones? And what we found, employers, for example, many people say, oh, you know, all you care about is gender, because the data has been freely available and organizations have, you know, created programs and initiatives and, you know, celebrated role models and spotlighted when they're doing kind of good works. So the employers who've been motoring away on that can use that to say, look, we want to be the best in class. We want to do better on ethnicity. We haven't been able to because the data is going to help us inform where we need to start, where we need to kind of break through, maybe where there's a plateau and, you know, people are stuck as far as where the lack of representation is. But as I said at the beginning, it's really about trust, where you build up that trust. And what we encourage employers to do is use the multiple levers of communication. So some will trust their managers, some will trust the employee network, some will trust the trade unions, whatever, pull every lever together. And then as you can demonstrate what you've done and you're doing some good stuff once you get the data, then people are like, okay, this is working. And if it's coupled with some actions that you introduce as well, people realize that you're serious about this and you're not just going to use this to, you know, block people. No, actually you want to open and widen opportunities.
Well, Sandra, thank you. Liz, I don't know whether or not we're going to be able to share the slides that we've got. We tried to prepare, Sandra, to your point, a set of slides which give us a sense of what's currently being reported. And I don't know whether Luke's joined us or Liz, you're going to talk us through this.
Yeah, I'll give it a go.
Okay, thank you.
That's okay. That's okay. Morning, everybody. I can't claim responsibility or credit for the data, but I'll talk a little bit about what we can see here. We've just pulled together a few slides. This is a PwC survey that just talks about which companies are giving this a go and which companies have decided not at the moment. And in our PwC said that 95% of UK companies don't analyse their ethnicity pay gap, and we obviously run at Tortoise our Responsibility 100 index that looks just at the FTSE 100 and found that 2 of the FTSE 100 report their ethnicity pay gap. This, I think, was for Q2 this year. So clearly it's a minority activity at the moment. And if we go to the next one, this is talking about representation, which goes back, I think, to Steve's point, which is it's possible that the reason why this is something that is sort of treated as a don't need to activity by these large organisations potentially is related to the fact that there's not good quality representation in the senior levels in these companies. So you've got 92 of the FTSE 100 didn't even report the BAME, albeit with the qualifications that's not always a helpful term. They don't report the breakdown of BAME people on their senior management teams, but 8 that did. So you get a sense that perhaps this just isn't a conversation that has been historically happening in the boardroom. And this again is sourced from our Responsibility 100 index. Next one. And then this I talked about a little bit earlier in the chat, which looks at if you were to apply a sort of BAME grouping and report on average hourly pay gaps on that grouping, you might look at this graph, the data's only correct up to 2018, and kind of think, brilliant, we've cracked it. But when you separate out, for example, in this case, Black people, you can see a much bigger gap. So that really is just sort of unpacking a bit what we've said, that the BAME grouping is not always helpful for a whole variety of reasons. My question, I suppose, and something for us to think about today, is whether we should let perfect be the enemy of the good, and whether it's better to have some reporting than none at all, on the basis that these intersectional groups are challenging to get to sort of drill down to statistically. If we go to the next one, this sort of goes a bit further in the into that sort of drill down, if you like, saying that Asian and Black ethnic categories have different and divergent pay gaps, and you can see this over time, how much it can move. So we're kind of suggesting that we have a different. We can't expect for the trend to be smooth and always in the right direction, I suppose. And the final one, I think. And this is a series of practical recommendations which we might unpack, and some of them we have touched on already, which is about the question of gathering data, which we were just talking about before. There's some sensitivities around that, about keeping it and storing it, about the accountability, which I think is a cultural thing that is related, I believe, to representation in senior management, about awareness. And there has been a lot of work, I think, recently, my sense is anyway, that large corporations in particular and small are trying to think in a better and more positive and proactive way about how to talk about race and ethnicity and different types of discrimination in the workplace. The advice about how to recruit fairly has been quite well known for some time. I'm not sure it's been as well practiced for some time, but that to me would seem to be a very important element of the sort of package of measures that can help to make this better. Transparency about processes. We're still, particularly in this country, we're very squeamish about pay transparency in all organisations, not even just in the workplace, but in our sort of personal lives as well. We're all very squeamish about saying what our earnings are and what have you, and that doesn't help. And then obviously the number 6 is the role of legislators, policymakers, regulators, to try and enforce and keep us all honest on some of those things. So it really is a case of a big package of measures that would help us to make some progress. And I think that was the last one. I hope I did an okay job on Luke's.
Liz, thank you. It's incredibly helpful. I mean, the most helpful thing, I don't know what the point 7 should be of the McGregor Smith review, which is that all of these things have been proposed, and almost everyone, when it came out, said that's a very good thing, we must get on with it. And then a tiny, tiny fraction of companies actually did. That's the sort of shocking and extraordinary thing about it, is how little progress there's been since then. But thank you for setting it up. Halima, I'm going to come back to you, and if I may, after that, I'm going to bring in Ian Duffy, because I just wanted to know, just to pick up on that penultimate slide, or the last, the two of those in the middle there, about differences within, if you like, non-white pay and remuneration. And there's a debate going on, as you, as Liz was talking about, you know, is BAME, is Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, is it a useful term? Does it lead to imperfect data? Is imperfect better than none at all? Halima, what's your experience of differentials within Black, Asian and ethnic minority pay? Hold on, we can't quite hear you. One sec. Hang on.
Can you unmute? Okay.
Now we've got you. There, thank you.
So we've known for the last 50 years that there are differences between minority groups, and that British Bangladeshi, British Pakistani groups and British Black groups are at one end of the pay scale compared to British Indian and British Chinese. We've always known this, but I think you can actually go beyond that data to show differences in pay, even when you've accounted for differences in class, for example, and socioeconomic. What I find a little bit concerning about this discussion is that we're getting lost in the complexity of methodology and data. I think we've just heard from Zurich that they have actually started something that is amazing. They've even told us that their gap, the ethnicity pay gap, what we like to call as the ethnicity penalty, really penalty pay, is at 9.8%. They already know that. They've also said that this relates to structural issues in their actual labor force.
Yeah.
They also said to us that their lack of BAME representation, I know that we don't like the term BAME, but the lack of representation of minority groups relates to senior grades. Well, if we know this, we know what the action that needs to follow needs to be. What we're saying with our partners is that once you actually do the measurement of the data, it actually tells you that something's not quite right. Yes, we need to work hard at creating trust in the workplace so that everybody feels safe to declare. But actually, let's face it, why shouldn't employees feel safe enough to declare their ethnicity? I should feel reasonably comfortable to tell this group here that I'm British, Bangladeshi and Muslim and actually have ability. That shouldn't feel wrong in any way. So the very idea that we are talking about creating trust and the need to be able to declare this tells me that we haven't really worked on that kind of hearts and minds piece a little bit.
Yeah.
Every employer needs to do this, create that space so that declaring our ethnicity, declaring our care challenges at home as a working mother or a working father shouldn't feel wrong, for example. But where we have committed to measuring voluntarily, we know what the action needs to be. So what we're saying to our partners and everybody that's interested in making progress here is that once you've got the data, it's telling you something, analyze it. So Deloitte, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Zurich and others have actually given that analysis, and they can tell for themselves where the action plan needs to be geared towards senior representation. So I think it would be more useful to talk about that rather than get derailed on methodology. We know that you can get the best economists around the table, they'll figure out methodology for this, to look at ethnicity differentials and so on. The methodology isn't the issue is our political will and our commitment to getting to a state where this needs to be mandatory in terms of reporting, and if it's not mandatory, what other measures can be put in place within the workplace? It's not just a carrot approach, it needs to be a carrot and a stick approach. And at the moment, if you just have this conversation in terms of mandatory reporting, I think you might lose some people, and then if you don't lose them, there'll be a bunch of others that will just say it's just really difficult to do. It doesn't need to be difficult or complex.
So Halima, thank you. I'm sure you're right. I suspect Ian Duffy might be about to say exactly the same thing. But Ian, can I bring you in and just talk about? Can you tell us a little bit about how you think about these in a big company?
James, as you know, I work at BP, and I've been the one who's written our gender pay gap reports for most of the time since it was introduced. This fundamentally comes down to trust and culture and values in the organisation. So the employees have to be able to trust it, exactly as Halima said, that their data is going to be used for responsible reasons and for fairness and meritocracy within the company. The really interesting bit that I saw with gender pay gap reporting was the conversation that it's opened up within different businesses. So at BP, we've got 5 reporting entities for the UK, and there's actually quite significant structural differences between each of those 5 entities, even though we're one company. And they were the really interesting conversations that were opened up about both gender equality within individual companies and within BP as a whole. My understanding is that we've actually got pretty high self-declaration rates on ethnicity in our employee database. And so it will be pretty much the same methodology and process for calculating an ethnicity pay gap. What we're looking at the moment, though, is going a little bit further, and we're starting a conversation amongst the employees about kind of very comprehensive self-identification reporting to be able to do what Zurich have done, which is to be able to understand the gaps on any particular characteristic you want to look at.
And Ian, can I just ask you one thing? One of the experiences, before we started Tortoise, I worked at the BBC, and one of the things that we experienced around gender pay gap reporting, which I think people may have noticed was quite widely covered, was that within an organisation, as you say, you talk about 5 reporting units in BP. Within an organisation, there are very different patterns because there are different jobs, but there are also different cultures. And I wondered whether or not in an organisation like BP, you see something similar. You see some parts of the company that want to pull ahead much faster, and others, largely just because they're uncomfortable about what the numbers will tell you about their part of the business, invent reasons or make the case for moving more slowly.
That's a good question. I personally don't see that problem at BP, because we're such an international company. Probably the challenge is actually some of the organisational units are not just UK focused, some of them are international. So what you've got is assessing basically a UK data set, but across a global population. And so some of the conversations it provokes in other countries around the world are really interesting, because they then ask the question of, well, if you can do it in the UK, why aren't you disclosing that data in other countries around the world? So that's a really interesting bit. In terms of
pulling
ahead or not, I don't see that happening, because actually it's about values and culture again.
Yeah, I do recognise one thing, which is when we've had this conversation previously, and I said, I'd talk to people like Sandra Kerr, and I'm come to Trevor Phillips in a moment if I might, is that there are some countries, of course, where identification also leads to issues of persecution and safety. So there are some genuine issues here, I know, for big global businesses like yours. But Ian, thank you. It's really, really interesting to see what you're doing, Zurich's doing, others. Trevor Phillips, are you there? Morning, Trevor. How are you?
I'm very well, James. How are you? Can you hear me?
So I feel like we held a thinking last night on imposter syndrome, right? And you'll see that imposter syndrome is alive and well, in that I am holding this conversation where really I think probably you do a far better job of it. But Trevor, what do you make of this? Why is it in 2020? We are in a world where 92 companies in the FTSE don't even report their senior management breakdown, and that we've allowed this lag between gender pay gap reporting and ethnicity pay gap reporting. What do you think is the politics of it, and what do you think is the answer to it?
Well, I think there are different situations in every company, but I'll make 3 quick points. One, I agree completely with Halima. We should just get on with it. And I think if we made a mistake, to be honest, in the way we argued this to begin with, the case for mandatory ethnicity pay gap reporting actually is one of fairness between companies. The problem with voluntary reporting is that the people who do the reporting are the people who get punished. So actually, yes. I think the case that should have been made is that if we're going to do this, we should do it for everybody, and there should be transparency across the board. But I think the case for getting on with it is inescapable. However, the problem is that I slightly disagree with people who say that the methodology and so on doesn't matter, because we have a couple of hundred clients in our group, which is recruitment and data analytics and so on, who are beginning to deal with all of this. And their problem actually is one of comparability. And it is a technical problem which has, well, several components, but the two key ones are everybody has to, if we're going to do this properly, everybody has to have the same number of categories. And somebody has to decide, is it 2 categories? Is it 6 categories? Is it 18 ONS categories? In order for people to be able to do this properly. And the number of categories is very, very important to the result that you get. If you analyze by 2 categories, you're going to get one set of results, which will push you in a particular direction. If you analyze by 50 categories, which is possible, then you'll get another sort of result. And I'll just give you an example. We did an analysis for a very big employer, hundreds of thousands of employees. And one of the things that they found was there was a difference between Ghanaians and Nigerians in both their rates of employment and pay. Now, you can't just wish that away. And the other point, which I would like just to throw into this discussion, is really a question about why we're so obsessed with self-identification. We did some work for a health authority, ran 1 million transactions, and we discovered that amongst Sikh, people with Sikh names, I should say, about 30% ticked the box marked white, which translated as white British. So self-identification doesn't necessarily tell you what you want to know. And even more important, there's a more profound question which we're wrestling with, which is, the truth of the matter is people don't get discriminated against because of what they think they are. They get discriminated against because of what everybody else thinks they are. So measuring what people think they are doesn't necessarily tell us what the real issue is in each company. So we need to think a bit harder about that. I don't think we've got an answer yet, but I think it's a question that just needs to be addressed.
And Trevor, just to pick up on a couple of those things. One, I should have introduced Trevor. Many people know him. He was the head of the Commission for Racial Equality, amongst many other things. But the reason, Trevor, I just wanted to pick up on 2 of the points you made. What's the, I know this is an invidious question, but what's the correct number between the 2 categories and the 50 categories? 50 feels like a lot for any company to be able to cope with. 2 feels like a blunt instrument. Do you have a view on what's the reasonable number?
I would go with the ONS 18 categories. It's not that difficult, actually, for most companies, and consistent with most other measurements.
And then the second thing I just want to say is just that thing you said about the 30% Sikh. I don't know whether it was men or women, but either way, that's both identifying as white British. What's the understanding for why that's the case?
Well, I think part of it is actually just straightforward. The particular form that they use, I think was badly designed. And I think, companies like Zurich and so on are better at this. But what we do know, for example, another sample we did, about half of people with Turkish Cypriot names, I should say, tick the box called white British because that's what they want to be thought of. So we do have a problem with some of this, which should not be an obstacle to getting on with it. But getting on with it will involve not just saying go and do it, but actually setting some rules so we've got consistency. And I think that's probably the next and most urgent step. Whatever in a sense, it doesn't in the end matter too much what these rules are, as long as they're consistent for everybody. And I think that's the thing that we need to do quite urgently. Can I just make a quick point, James, about the accuracy on chat? I wasn't at all criticizing Zurich. I think what Zurich has done is fantastic, but we do need to understand that one of the differences with gender, which is binary, and ethnicity, which is multiple, is purely one of mathematics. If you only collect data for 80% of people on ethnicity, and you just make a binary split, the maths works out that your margin of error for the proportion that are from ethnic minorities could be as high as 20%, and that makes the data useless. So I think we need to be, we need to pay attention to the geeky end of this. Sorry to poke that in here, but that's what we spend our time doing, looking at spreadsheets.
Trevor, can I just finish up with one sort of philosophical question for you, given that you've worked in this area? And I'm going to come to Anne-Marie Blake, because I see that Anne-Marie is here with us too, and I know Anne-Marie's worked on this for a good while as well. This is a philosophical question, if you like, Trevor, which is when you think about these issues and you think essentially about systemic injustice within our economy, do you think now, looking at it, these are issues that are going to be best dealt with by fundamental changes to rights, i.e. the introduction of economic rights? Do you think that incentive-driven change is sufficient, i.e., culture and shaming and the way in which, indexes and data point to different kinds of behavior? Or do you think we need to move to new business norms, as would be suggested by things like mandatory pay gap reporting reinforced by law? Like, how do you think is the best way to move things on? I.e., how forcible do you think things need to be?
Well, I think that the means of achieving your second point are actually in your third point. The point about mandatory pay reporting, it doesn't make anybody do anything, except insofar as it forces comparison and transparency. And one of the things that we do know about contemporary norms, or let me put it more precisely, what drives behaviors both in the labour market and also in businesses is that we now have a much more open economy, in the sense that we can see what goes on inside companies. It used to be the case a company would tell you, we're the best, we do this, we do that, and you wouldn't know because you couldn't see inside it. Now we have much more transparency, and consumers can choose, employees can choose. So I think that the point about these regulatory steps is not that they're forcing somebody to do anything, but they are changing the climate and the environment in the market, and that's what makes a difference.
Okay, Trevor, thank you. I am going to come back particularly to Steve just to hear, I take Trevor's point about, the ones that act first often get the most attention and therefore find it the most difficult. But can I just bring in Anne-Marie Blake? Because Anne-Marie, I saw in the chat, and there's a lot of conversation, and I know I'm just catching up with it. But Anne-Marie, hello. I'm glad to see you're smiling widely. Everything I read that you said in the chat sort of makes me put my head in my hands. Tell me your read on this.
Yeah, so I have come to this quite recently. So I have two jobs. So I have a day job that pays my mortgage, but as a volunteer, I'm on the board of the Race, Ethnicity and Equity Board. And we were formed probably July, at back end of July, I think, because we were, after the whole George Floyd thing, we were quite surprised at the amount of stories that were being told by kind of Black and ethnic minority colleagues within our industry about some of the discrimination that they'd faced. So we formed a board to kind of have action. And one of the first things that we decided to tackle, and why I'm here today, is the ethnicity pay gap. And I get all the arguments about, it's in the difficult box, which is why people don't do it. Or if you're in a small agency, then again, it's difficult because you can have one person go off and then it skews all of your data and results. But that's not a reason for it not to be done. So we are getting all of our members, so PRCA members are PR agencies in the main,
right, yes,
PR, and Comms Association, to sign up. So we have a range of big agencies and small agencies that are members to sign up to actually commit to working on their ethnic pay data, and we will help them do it. If they're saying, we've got no idea where to start, we will help them do it. So I think that's kind of why we're trying to mobilise, because I think that it's in the difficult box isn't an excuse not to do it, and we think this is kind of one of the real things that can make a change to people within our industry. And it's not to name and shame. Not to name and shame, actually, that's the other thing. I'm not in the naming and shaming business. I know, I think there was a comment in the chat that, well, you don't get people to make action unless you name and shame. But then, I think my take is sometimes you get a few more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. And if we want to really, really make a change, then we want to help people to do this.
And Anne-Marie, one question, particularly in that sector, right, the PR sector, which obviously as journalists we know quite well, the mandatory pay gap reporting on gender is for companies over 250 employees. And a lot of the sector you're describing has companies with fewer employees than that. How do you think we should approach those smaller companies, you know, which might have their own reasons, whether it's geography or history or simply size, that says, look, you know, we don't necessarily fit the same patterns that your PwCs or your Zurichs or your BPs do.
Well, I mean, working with them, I had a conversation with someone that runs a small agency. I think they have fewer than 100 employees, and they have zero gender pay gap because, you know, that's something that they just don't have. And they really, really want to do this, but, you know, they were explaining to me that it's very, very difficult. So, for example, they may have had 3 colleagues and, you know, one has left, and therefore that kind of skews their numbers. So in my limited experience, I'd have to say, the smaller agencies that really want to get involved, that it's not because they don't want to get involved, it's because they don't know how and what to do. And I think they're looking for us, you know, to kind of help them do this, because I think there's another comment in the chat, something like there are only 800,000 employed Black people, and that's potentially because you know, they've got sick of it and set up their own consultancies. You know, that's kind of what I've done, and, you know, several of my colleagues have done. And, you know, I have no gender or race pay gap because I kind of pay myself. But yeah, I mean, it's difficult. Yeah, and you know, that's why I'm here today, really, to learn a lot more about how people are doing it.
Okay, well, Anne-Marie, for what it's worth, if we can help you at Tortoise with that work with PRs and comms agencies, do let us know. Do just message me or Liz, and we'll follow up, because we know, you know, obviously we know a fair few people in that world too, and we're all thinking about this question. Can I just? I want to come back to Steve Collinson, because Steve, I wanted to pick up on the points that were made by Trevor and others about the non-reporting of the 14%, but also the cultural impact of those companies that go first, and some of the points that Halima was making about the way in which it's working in big companies like yours. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've learned, and if you were, you know, if you were king for the day and you imposed all of these pay gap reporting on all companies immediately, what you would advise them to prepare for?
Yeah, so let me just focus on our experience in the last few months. The core reason we decided to declare all of our pay gaps and to go first with ethnicity is because our employee resource groups, and we have a number like many big organizations do, but our cultural awareness network, our BAME resource group, using my own term that I dislike, but our cultural awareness network wanted us to push this data. They wanted us to use it as another shot in the arm to the debate around ethnicity representation in our organization. And I have a brave and committed exec team of colleagues who were ready and prepared to do so. What it's done is really, in internal social media and in conversations, has allowed our ethnicity debate to progress to the next level. We were already having a good, open discussion. And since the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, that had increased too. But this has pushed us to the next level. You have to be ready for that. I think organizations have to be ready, willing, and able to have the conversation. But in reality, we've taken our senior leaders have been able to step away from the conversation. And some of our most junior people are driving this debate because they are desperate for really good representation right across the organization. And I encourage people to say, there's a real danger here that we fall into analysis paralysis. And I understand the points made around data and lack of reporting. And yes, of course, there's a margin of error. But we're in danger of falling into analysis paralysis, which my sector, the financial services sector, is one of our biggest challenges.
Steve, analysis paralysis I get. What about anger?
We haven't seen levels of anger. We have seen very open conversations. So I have a mentoring relationship with a junior member of our organization, or more junior to the position I'm privileged to sit in, who's from the Black community, who we have a mentoring relationship. She helps me to understand far more about this topic than I ever could on my own. We haven't seen levels of anger. We've seen really open, inspired conversations and difficult questions.
Right. Well, Steve, thank you. I said earlier on I wanted to hear from Paul Atherton. Paul, I don't know whether you're still here. Paul, are you there? Hello. Paul, I'm going to give you the last word if I can. I don't know whether you're frozen or I am. Paul, I'm sorry, I think...
Are you there?
Yes. Hello.
Hi.
Just in under the wire. Okay. So we've got a minute and a half. Tell us your thoughts on this, and then I'm going to wrap up.
Yeah, I think part of the problem with, we've been talking about the statistics and the methodologies, and I actually think that's really important. And I think sometimes we're being driven by the idea that these things are true, and therefore we're going to find the statistics to underpin that, rather than actually asking the original question, is what we believe to be true actually true? And I think one of the most important things is collating data that's meaningful. And I think a big problem at the moment, especially with ethnicity, is that we think there's a generic wide problem across the UK, and we haven't actually got the evidence to back that up yet. And I think we should focus on gathering firm, reliable data to allow us to make an actual decision on what's really going on, as opposed to what's perceived to be happening.
Okay, well, I completely agree, and I think that the point I suppose that Halima was making right at the start was that's just going to spur a whole load of action. Paul, thank you. In the spirit of collecting data, we are going to try to finish with a poll. Sam Hockley, I don't know whether or not this is a technical feat that is beyond us. Oh, hang on, Liz is weighing in. Here comes the poll. Could you just answer this question? Do you believe that mandatory pay gap reporting is effective in reducing pay inequality at work? I think we're slightly leading the witness here, but let's see, where do we get to? Liz, do you have the power here? Are you, hang on, no, we can all see. Oh, wow, that's good. So you can see the answer is 90% think yes, 6.7% think no, and interestingly 3.3%, always the wise, say that they don't know. Listen, I just wanted to say, to wrap this up, I suppose, the first thing was just a simple point to say thank you to Halima Begum, to Tom Hayes, to Steve Collinson, because for those of you who work a good deal in this area, this is something that you know a good deal about. For those of us trying to understand why something that seems so obvious has got caught either in the gears of corporate life or politics and legislation, it's incredibly helpful to have this time, this hour. And also, the more that we get into the detail, understanding which categories work, how ethnicity reporting can work, actually it makes it much simpler. And usually when I sum up a ThinkIn, and as you know, the aim of Tortoise is to come to a more informed point of view, you often come to what's actually quite a textured point of view, a sort of either a yes but point of view or a to be sure point of view. The beauty of this particular subject is it seems to me incredibly clear that we should be very simply pressing ahead with a requirement for ethnicity pay gap reporting. It will deliver, to Paul Atherton's point at the end there, a level of understanding of how our country really works and where it doesn't. And so for us, our Tortoise point of view, informed by this discussion, is that we should be pressing ahead and pressing the government to press ahead. So in that spirit, thank you. A big thank you, as I said, to Halima, Tom and Steve, but thank you everyone for joining us this morning. For those of you who still have thoughts to thrash out, we actually get together Tuesdays as our open news meeting, and we have been really struck in the last week by the number of people in the UK in very senior positions, i.e. cabinet ministers and former presidents of the Supreme Court, questioning the extent to which we should obey the law, whether it's in Brexit or COVID. And so today at lunchtime, we're going to be talking about the law and 2020. Please join us at 1 o'clock. But for those of you who've got a day to get on with, do enjoy it. Have a very good day, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.